Well, look, without further ado, I'd like to welcome everyone to this week's virtual cafe. We're tracking on right through the semester across all three campuses. We certainly are at Swinburne, and I know things are at a very advanced stage at Western Sydney, and I don't think UQ is that far off finishing as well. This week, very excitingly, we're transitioning to a look at media, and we're also going to be doing that next week. I'm very, very excited to announce that we have Chris Colter speaking to us today, who is the Chief Strategy Officer at Initiative, Initiative Australia, I guess. Is that correct, Chris?
Yep.
And I think Chris operates out of Sydney, although I'm sure he moves around the country a little bit. Well, certainly pre-COVID-19 anyway.
Correct. When I was allowed to, yeah.
I know a little bit about Chris, and I don't know if he knows that I know. But Chris is a graduate of Charles Sturt University. He did his BA Communications Advertising there, and then he went on to be one of the few students to do honours in advertising at Charles Sturt. And I know that because I was one of his markers. I don't know if you knew that.
I didn't know you were one of my markers, but I knew you were there at the time.
And also John Gregg worked at Charles Sturt. So I don't know if you might have met him there as well.
Yeah.
So
small world.
It's a very small world. Well, Charles Sturt, historically has been an amazing program, of course. But now, of course, the leading programs are Western Sydney, Swinburne, and UQ. Hey, look. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the session to you, and we're going to run for about upwards of 40 minutes. We'll see how we go. And then we're going to have a little bit of time at the end for Q&A, and I'm hoping that the students ask you some tough questions, because this is that one opportunity where they can really ask you in your position some tough questions about media. It's a complex area at the moment, and they've got a complex brief. So thank you.
David,
no worries.
Chris, have you seen the brief?
I haven't, to be honest. I've got the rough crib notes, and so that's why I'm like, I hope that this is useful for you guys. Okay. But what I'll try to do as much as possible is I'll race through some stimulus and some stuff to throw in front of you about best practice media planning, and then try to get through that relatively quickly so we can have a bit of a dialogue and you can ask pointier questions. But I've kind of gone at it from like a broad brushstrokes point of view. I've tried to provide as much useful utility for you guys, because I know that like one of the biggest challenges of in particular trying to work on media related campaigns from university is access to a lot of the stuff that we actually use day in, day out. We've got sophisticated planning tools, we've got DMPs and addressable analytics solutions, and we can get really good reads of what's happening in market, what are the factors, and we're powered by a whole lot of intelligence that you guys just simply don't have access to. But I've found a bunch of stuff that I usually just use as a quick reference that you guys can then start to implement into your media thinking and decisioning process. So I'll kick on. David gave a bit of a spiel about who I am. I just wanted to say I've got some good experience. I've worked across pretty much every single category in market, aside from auto, which is great for you guys on this one. And it's a bit of a challenge for me, given the fact that I'm such a passionate car fan. So it's sort of like my white whale, but that's okay. The opportunity will arrive soon. I've won quite a lot of awards, so I do okay at what I do. But as David mentioned as well, like media strategy was kind of like my passion point when I was back at university, and I did my entire dissertation on account planning and what makes a good strategist. So hopefully the stuff that I put in front of you today is pretty sound thinking, and I haven't made an ass of myself through such a self-indulgent introduction. But I just wanted to give you confidence that what I'm going to talk to you today will be relevant. So instead of talking you through sort of Media 101, what do you do, I'll definitely touch on some of that stuff. I figured couching it around how I would go around solving this brief and kind of taking you through almost like a step-by-step process, some of the things that I would look at, some of the tools that I would use, and some of the frameworks that I would almost present thinking back to, because I feel like sometimes learning through practice is always more useful. And so I'll give you an example about almost like how I would approach this if I was given this challenge. And ultimately, day in, day out, different things change, but everything that I do comes down to 4 fundamental principles about how I approach any campaign or any plan. first and foremost is always making sure that you feast on brain food, which what I basically mean there is do as much research as possible. Read as much as you can about the category as possible. Read consultant articles, read comment sections on news articles, follow different random like enthusiast pages. Just make sure you broaden your possible wealth of understanding about that category as much as possible, because I can tell you now, if you don't do that at the start and you're like 3/4 of the way through the response and you're trying to figure out whether or not tactic A works to convert audiences over tactic B, you then have to go and try and research and learn all of that. When your brain's cooked, that's really difficult to do. So make sure you look at as many sources that you can find and get that category laydown, understanding what's what's trending, what's delivering performance for clients, and have a point of view there. The next, you probably heard this from all of your other strategist people that have talked to you around this, but it's really about getting to the goal. Like clients kind of say, I've got $2 million and I want to do 5, 6 different things. But being really laser pointed at what the core critical objective is really important when it comes to media, because that leads the cascading choices of how much money we invest in TV versus out of home, or whether or not we do a partnership with this brand or that brand. And so it's really important for us to understand the role that we play in the broader comms planning mix. The next one is really adopting the audience. And this is about understanding drivers, barriers, need states, who you target as much as sort of where you target is super critical. And then lastly, and most importantly, is, strategy isn't so much telling you what to do. It's actually more telling you what not to do. Like if we had all of the budget in the world, we would literally do everything and we would blanket the world and we'd buy all of the media. We'd Clive Palmer it up, if you will. But we don't have all of the budget in the world. So we need to be sacrificial in the choices that we make, and they need to be informed from a data-backed base point. So feasting on brain food, one thing that I will always say until I go blue in the face is always start product out, not desktop down. So if you can, lockdown's restricted, all that sort of stuff, I understand, but go and actually try and experience it as a consumer and try and understand, if I was to try and buy a car, what would my experience be? Now, that can be the digital experience. So go on the car sales, look at what Suzuki's like and see what they're marketing themselves as. Go onto their OEM website. So understand what's the Suzuki website look like versus their competitors. If you have the luxury of actually going and walking into a dealership, go and do that and go and kick the tires on them and their competitors, because I can guarantee you that's where you'll really find your nugget of an insight, because everyone has access to Google. Everyone has access to desktop research. And if you start there, you'll probably end up in the same place that everyone else can. So that's what you really need to focus on from a get-go. Then when you go out into Google, the good news is there's an absolute ton of good free shit out there that will help you feast on that brain food, right? So as I said before, understanding where you want to hunt and what you want to find, there's some serious gold nuggets that exist out there in the world that are easily discoverable. This is just what I found looking for all of 5 minutes the other day that are freely available, very verifiable reports and studies based on what the car buying journey is, how people come into contact with media across those touch point journeys, what are the points across the overall sort of experience where friction exists, and, what's media's role in facilitating that. You can easily go out there and find this information, provided you know where to look. And I know that's the hard part for you guys at the moment. So take a photo of this, watch the video afterwards. But, I've just given you a bit of a laydown in some of the places that I would typically start looking. I would always go to the pros. So, in fact, there's a Deloitte digital brief is actually a big free kick, because they're usually one of the more open source consultants in terms of their reports and their thought leadership pieces. They look at your PwCs, your KPMGs, your Mintels, those sorts of environments, because you're likely to find that they've talked about something around auto that you can leverage. Nielsen, Roy Morgan, whilst you don't have access to the actual dashboards that we would usually build and look into, the interactive stuff, they do reports, and they do sentiment trackers and even brand health studies. JWD, Intel, BBH Labs, a lot of agencies try to position themselves as thought leaders in this space, and they do a lot of good work, rigorous research to actually showcase that. So again, steal that with pride. Industry bodies. So even things like the Australian Association or the Australian Automobile Dealer Association and some of those places are really good to hunt for. And then like research companies like Utah, those sorts of places. Publishers is another thing that you can also do. And, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but I will. Like if you probably flicked someone an email at 9 and asked to see, told them your situation and what you're going through and said, do you have any on-shelf car research that you'd be able to share with me as a student? I'm sure that they would have a report that would flick your way. That's typically something that we do at a media agency is we'll go out to our partners and know that they do a whole bunch of research. So we just sprawl and ask what they've got on hand because it's super handy and it streamlines all of your insight work. You can cut days, weeks out of the research process by doing this. Platforms, so Facebook IQ, Think with Google, Global Web Index, Walk, eMarket or Statista are also great places to get stats, insights, and trend experiences. And then finally, go and follow some good people. Sweathead is a community group on Facebook, and they are an open source strategy group that tries to share insights and thoughts and frameworks in a sort of open source environment. So there's plenty that you can steal from those guys in those environments. So hopefully that helps. The other thing I would also say is when you Google search, just click past year. You can get really tricked up real quickly getting a report from 2013 and then thinking that trend A is going to be the new trend of the future, even though, it's kind of already faded and gone. So that's just the last bit of advice there. So the second point is once I've kind of read all of those reports, I've got some interesting nuggets. I've written down things that I think are consistent across those reports as well. I look to try and find commonalities because, if there's being identified across multiple different things, then it is probably a category truism. I then go look into, okay, I've got my background information. I can now review the brief, knowing from a position of confidence that I've got a pretty good lay of the land. There's a famous saying, if you try to chase two rabbits, you won't catch either of them. And every single brief that I have from a client is I need to grow awareness, consideration, and ultimately sales of my product. And you kind of try and poke and prod and pick at what's the most critical one, because ultimately how I'm going to be measured on my response and ultimately how it's actually going to deliver against their ambitions will change based on what that North Star is. What we've got here is typical sort of what I would call media objectives that we get briefed from clients. These are your typical off-the-shelf ones that they tend to poke and prod. They go from awareness all the way through to sales, and you therefore get pointier behaviors and pointier metrics to evaluate those. But basically, awareness is you need to just generate broad understanding amongst a maximum group of people, and therefore my lead tactic would just be maximize reach, push the message out there as much as possible, buy big billboards, buy lots of TV, and just blitz the market. Whereas if all of a sudden they need to boost consideration because that's actually not that awareness is not driving into that next stage of that consumer journey, I then need to think about tactics that really get them to lean in versus lean back, and how can I drive that engagement and that understanding. And it goes further and further and further in terms of, ultimately what I'm trying to drive. Not only does that have a media goal relevance to it, but it also has an audience relevance to it. So if my goal is to drive sales purely, then I'm going to focus on people that are in market right now and want to buy a car. And that's going to limit my overall reach, but it means that I'm going to convert people that are most likely to buy my car. Whereas if it's drive awareness and sales, can come, 3-6 months away, I can focus on brand building activity that I know will grow my pool for people that would buy the car more later, if that makes sense. So therefore, I'm doing bigger brand acts, less discrete marketing, less performance-based, and it's more around establishing a broader viewpoint. So in terms to get to some of those areas, you've probably seen this as well, right? Which is what we call the YYY framework. It's like my annoying toddler. It's a good way to think about it. But basically, when you get the challenge from the client, the first question you ask is what's getting in their way of growth, and then you start to really kind of delve underneath some of those factors and get an understanding of, what are the triggers that we need to actually connect. So really bad example, but you'll get the point of view here, is Suzuki want to sell utes. Okay, cool. What's getting in their way of growth? Well, nobody thinks of Suzuki when they think of utes. Why not? Because they think of tough brands that deliver to tradie lifestyles. Okay, so why don't they think of Suzuki in that mix? Well, it's because Suzuki markets themselves as a cheap teeny bopper brand. So therefore, they don't feel like they're tough and rigorous. Okay, cool. So therefore, it's not telling people that, hey, Suzuki, you've got a ute. It's actually driving reconsideration. It's flipping that whole for fun's sake and, using that as a platform for people that look for rugged, tough cars and what fun is to them, and then dramatizing how that brand can deliver in that moment. So it's not just a base awareness objective anymore, just saying, hey, there's a ute, buy it. It's actually about getting them to consider and reframe their association with that brand in that realm. So all of a sudden, from a media point of view, I'm starting to talk about engagement tactics. I'm starting to talk about influencers and some of those like influential voices, because I'm trying to change a perception versus just get it onto a radar. So that's a useful framework. I highly encourage that you play around with that. Oh, yuck, that was a disgusting transition. So what we can then do is then you would align those metrics. And this is kind of what I've half touched on before, but the further you get down the funnel, you get different style media metrics that you're trying to drive in terms of delivering that. I'll shoot this around afterwards so that you can look at it in your own leisure, but it's good to know where your North Star is from a media point of view, what you're going to measure, how much you're planning to grow, because that sets the objectives for all of your channel selection. So then, again, trying to race through this so that we can have a discussion. You can poke and prod me a bit, but we then get into audience identification. I think this is, from a media point of view, this is really the most critical lens that we can provide, right? Because who you target, who you place the message in front of, and understanding what their daily behaviors are, what their media consumption is, and understanding what media works for what brand objective is really the crux of everything that we do. And having broad, basic, easy to get demographics that you would usually get on a creative brief, in terms of we're targeting, midlife, high net worth mums, is not enough when you get to a media audience. Because if you think about, a 40-year-old, woman with a household income of 100K and who is a parent, that could be Kim Kardashian or it could be Jacinta Ardern. They're very different people. And so the ability to be able to identify who you're targeting and what you're focusing your media on is really critical. So what we always encourage people to do, and this is a pretty basic tool that we look to use, is you start with your age, your broad audience. You start to then segment based on if there is a gender difference or, an over index of one gender over another. If there's geographic considerations that you need to take into account, like, is this a metro-only campaign? Is it metro-regional? What are the sort of focuses that we need to do there? But overlaying like behavioral and psychographic information is really critical. What are their interests? What are their hobbies? What are their behaviors? Because you should be trying to buy almost like a lifestyle of an audience versus a demographic, because that's more indicative of a relationship with a brand. And another way you could visualize this, which I think is actually in many ways better, is through a flow chart, because it shows those cascading choices when you're talking to a client about, instead of going after, let's say we've got 22.5 million people, this is an SUV, doesn't resonate with our audience. So, with those that don't have kids, we're a family specific brand, so we're going to target families. We want to avoid those that live in regional areas because we just don't have the dealer footprint that exists there. And we want to target those people that are, shopper mindset, very frivolous and, happy-go-lucky in their lifestyle. So therefore, our high-value audience that sits within this are our online savvy families. As just a rough guide of doing that. But it allows you to talk the client through, we're making strategic sacrifices in who we're targeting to get to an audience that is going to have a disproportionate benefit to you as a brand. Luckily, Facebook's got a good bit of kit in their audience insight tools. So again, screen grab this, have a look at that website, but you're able to go in there and have a good sense of what the reach of a population is. You can start to overlay interests and audiences. So that chart that I just showed you there, where you've got numbers on each of those waterfall tiers, you can actually start to replicate, because you can go, okay, if we're targeting, total people 18 plus, have 20 million people, but if we overlay those that are interested in, gaming, if that was an audience you're going after, that then takes that audience down to 19.4 million. And if we want to overlay those that live in New South Wales, and you can start to get really choiceful in your audience targeting off the back of that. So jump on there, have a play. It's open source, and it's actually really useful. Once you've then profiled that audience, you then have to understand that audience. And I find tools like this, or frameworks like this, which is just like a classic audience archetype, are really useful. So again, using different data sources and talking to audiences, doing survey monkeys, that sort of stuff, you can get a really good understanding of who people are based on consistent clusters of information that links to that audience. So, what you can see here is your adventurous luxury traveler really doesn't lean into brands and is heavily influenced by word of mouth. So therefore, social is going to be really key to engage this audience versus a big TV ad. I don't know why it's automatically swapping. They're actually really passionate about photography. So, when we're thinking about media environments or partners to go after, maybe we might do a brand partnership with Canon, or at the very least, we could, start to be in, websites that are all about tourism photography, or we could, even create an idea where you create a photography competition through a partner that, entices these people to get involved. It's all about comfort as an experience that they kind of lean into, and it's all about switch off stuff. So when you're thinking about activations, how do you help them relax in those environments, and what environments are they seeking to relax? And then you can look at their media consumption, a day in the life of, or even like whether it's time spent or channel preference, that sort of stuff, because that'll tell you really what channels you need to prioritize to reach this audience, or disproportionately engage them, if you will. Again, a couple of quick wins for live audience insight. So if you go to Facebook IQ, they've got an insights to go point of view. Not massive in terms of what you can actually get out of it, but it's still better than nothing, and it's useful to go on there and have a play with a segmented audience that you can get some statistics in terms of their category relationships. Think with Google has a Find My Audience demographic profiler. So what YouTube pages are they interested in, and what influencers do they follow? So that again gives you insight into the type of person this is. If they're the type of person that follows Mighty Car Mods, then they're probably like a heavy car enthusiast. So, it's a pretty easy link there. And then I included social bakers in here. You would have to sign up for a free trial, but that's also another easy hack for you at university, because if you can sign up for as many free trials and just scrape as much information as you can from these pages, and then just not actually subscribe long term, then you've actually got a pretty good free kick in terms of insight and detail. Cool. And then finally, this is where I'm going to get a bit nerdy and a bit sort of pointy in terms of media goal setting and stuff like that. And I apologize if this gets a bit too and too theory based, but I'm hoping that I convey it in an easy to understand way. But this is like almost like the 101 things that we think about when we do plan, that it would be useful from a baseline point of view. So the first and foremost is the discussion between efficiency versus effectiveness, right? Like there are channels that are quicker to reach an audience, that deliver a more immediate objective, but may not have that long-term effectiveness to it. And I love this quote from Rory Sutherland, which is, buying my wife flowers on February 15th is far more efficient. They're cheaper, right? Because they're on sale immediately after Valentine's Day. But she's not going to be happy, and so therefore it's not effective in terms of actually achieving that objective. And it's the same thing that we need to think about when we're thinking about media. What is cheaper, what delivers a disproportionate immediate ROI may not be the right channel for you, dependent on your objective. So really critically evaluating what is your core objective is really critical. One of the big conversations that has gone on in the media industry, I would say over the last 3 to 5 years, is the relationship towards digital versus what they call traditional channels, your TV, your billboards, your out of home. And a lot of the industry obviously heavily shifted a lot of money into digital media, right? Because it's hyper targeted, it's one to one. I can tell that you watched a YouTube video. I don't know for sure whether or not you stayed through that ad break and watched that TV ad. So your ability to report performance in real time is definitely accelerated. You can talk about relevance because you can get into niche environments at a level of scale. You know, there's that immediate measurement, as I said before, and it's kind of action oriented, right? When you're on a computer, you can click to a website immediately and you can go, great, that's had a disproportionate uplift as a media behavior. However, what's really interesting is the whole industry almost is starting to take that pendulum and try to swing it back towards your more traditional channels and get to almost like an equilibrium, a balance of brand versus performance, if you will. Because a lot of brands have realized if you focus too much on your digital channels, you don't actually deliver what's known as cultural priming, right? So you actually miss the ability to build a long-term, sustainable, and powerful brand. And what that term cultural priming basically relates to is, for me to see value in a brand, I need to know that you know what that brand represents. Right? So there's a reason why Rolex buys big, confident billboards and they have massive sponsorships in like the F1 and premium properties, right? Half of why they do that, if they wanted to, they could be hyper precise in targeting people that could afford a watch, right? They could use digital media and they can identify someone that has a household income of over $200,000. They could concentrate all of their out-of-home activity in Qantas Business Lounge, and they can minimize their wastage. But the reason why they buy those billboards is because for them to see value in that watch, they need to know that poor people know that that watch is expensive, right? Because that's why I value this watch now. Because if I didn't know that other people saw that as value, then I would just buy another product off the back. So building that brand association is really critical. You know, if I rock up to a party with a Corona, I'm doing that because it says something about me, not the Corona, a Corona. It says something about me comparative to a James Bogues, right? They give off different cultural signals. So it's important to have a level of cultural bleed, particularly when you're trying to build a brand or reset mass cultural perceptions. So that's a really important consideration. And then there's a whole bunch of research. I encourage you to look up Binet Field, you know, long and short of it is called, and all of that sort of stuff. But at the base level understanding is you can do all of these short-term campaigns that are immediately effective and drive ROI, but if you're not investing in building that broader brand understanding and cultural resonance, you're actually making that really difficult to actually perform over the long term. And one of the quotes that I like that articulates this point quite nicely is, if you spend all of these years watering a tree, so building a brand, but you don't pick your fruit, you're an idiot, right? So you need to still have that brand building, cultural priming, but doing those short-term focused activations to maximize that consumer behavior. But equally, if you haven't done that brand building, then you don't really have a tree to be able to pick fruit from. So you need to make sure that that balance is really in line. I hope that wasn't too ethereal. And then so the importance of having that as a baseline understanding, and the reason why I'm harping on about it is because different channels do different things better. So TV is better at driving mass reach. It's better at doing cultural priming. It's better at creating emotion. And it's better at almost creating that environment where everybody understands what you're talking about. Whereas online display does a job better at driving clicks on a website. It's better at getting people to evaluate their purchase, and it's better to reach people at a one-to-one level. So understanding each channel's strength is going to be critical to developing a strong and rigorous media plan. And so when it comes to how we plan, there's basically 4 R's that we always remember. You've probably already been told about this, but these are some ways that I like to think of it. First is around reach. First and foremost is the vast majority of people that you need to target are those people that will only ever buy your category once. right? If you focus on maximizing your reach against all people that would consider your category, you're more likely to increase your total audience pool to be able to connect. And an example that I like to lean into that on is, instead of spending money trying to double down on this guy and tell him to buy more Coke, because he ain't going to buy Pepsi, I would rather reach someone that might buy Pepsi and convince them to buy Coke. Yeah. So like, you want to maximize and get onto the consideration set as many people as possible, because these people are already loyal. They're already going to buy you most likely. Like, if you do have such a thing as a Suzuki enthusiast, then convincing them to buy a Suzuki actually isn't going to be that hard or less difficult. The next is an interesting one, which is around frequency second. And what I mean by this is some research that was done by YouTube that talked to the most effective frequency level that you need to engage an audience. And in high consideration categories, what you often have from marketers is that they say it's hard to get it, so you need to reach an audience 3 or more times for your campaign to be effective. But what this piece of research here shows is that if you looked at that graph, you would say, I need to focus on reaching people 4 times. But with that as a goal, you sacrifice reaching people once, more people once, because you're trying to optimize your campaign to reaching less people, but more times. And what that means is, if I reached less people, 800,000, and yes, they convert at a higher percentage, I effectively have a conversion pool of 256,000 people. That's great. However, if I can reach 1.2 million people, and sure, their conversion rate's less, but I'm shopping from a broader pool, that number now gets to 276,000. So if I've got more people than in market buying a car, that conversion is higher. Hope that makes sense, because I know that that's a bit sort of like high level, but ultimately focus on building reach, maximize 1+ against the total audience, and then go again. So have frequency as that secondary goal, not as your North Star starting point, and you'll have a better opportunity at converting a wider pool of audiences. The next is around relevance. So reach is great, but it's totally irrelevant if it's quickly ignored or forgotten. Context matters. So where you place your ad is really critical. If you do contextual targeting and you align it to a use case or when I would actually consider this product, you're more likely to convert. So think about morning commute and my iced coffee and my brain, right? If I own that moment, then all of a sudden I'm creating a mental association that iced coffee is good for the morning to keep me mentally alert. And that's my outtake from the message. We also know the more that you personalize something, particularly in today's curated culture, the more likely it's actually going to have a relevant benefit to them. So, Spotify's campaign where they give you your Wrapped 2019 playlist, everybody shared that because it was personalized and tailored to them. If it was just a generic How Good's music ad, would many people share it? I'd argue probably not. So thinking of tactics like that in terms of how you make it more relevant for your audience is going to be key. Recency, this one's pretty easy. If you're marketing a beer, kind of skew it towards that end of week when people are going to be able to drink it, because obviously owning that category entry point of consideration is going to be key. And then ultimately, when you're trying to engage audiences, focus on as much as possible being consistent in market. One of the examples that I'd use, and this is a campaign that I worked on quite a lot over the years, is around the Australia Day campaign. And that was always great. It was always a strong performer. But if I blow all of my money marketing Australia Day and then I don't talk to anybody for the rest of the year, then what's my consideration going to be like in June when I'm trying to get someone to buy lamb over beef? It's not like, oh, I remember that ad from January and that makes me interested to connect. So making sure you're as present in everyday life is going to be important, because top of mind awareness and retaining that is critical. And the last one's like revolution, this is a fun one, right? We know that novelty draws attention. So the more interesting you can make your ads, the more different, the more innovative, the more exciting, the more never been done before, you're actually primed to pay attention as a human being. So I worked on a campaign where we changed the color of Coke cans, because Coke cans have been the same color for years and years and years and years. And to connect with teens that saw it as red wallpaper, we simply changed the color of the Coke cans. And in an environment which was incredibly health conscious, we had all of these teens sharing pictures of Coke cans all over social because they thought it was cool. That's just a novel, light touch owned use of channel to be able to convert their interest. And we know that fame powers effectiveness. I worked on Tourism Australia for a long time, and for a fair while they were focusing on doing that job that I was talking about earlier around driving what they call leads, so getting people to a website to a book. Now, because they were doing that, they were focusing on discrete channels, hyper-targeted audiences, and then they were forgetting to fill the bucket and drive that brand demand and get them people to consider them in the first place. So we famously flipped that script and we went after the Super Bowl and we did that Dundee campaign, and we've massively changed Australia's tourism industry for the better until COVID kicked it in the balls. It's another story. So ultimately, at the end of the day, media planning in a nutshell is right person, right place, right time, right message, all of those elements that you hear and you get drummed into you. But one more thing I'll leave you with is make sure you also think about the selection of your channel and what the actual channel itself communicates, because the medium is the message. I know it's been said, but it is so true. And it's actually a fact that modern media planners have actually neglected to remember and acknowledge. You need to find the hybrid of those two. What's the right time, place, message to get it in front of it, and what's the channel going to communicate? Because the channel you choose impacts the outcome. This was a famous Brazilian campaign where they took racist tweets, right? So these were mediums in and of themselves. They were in Twitter, right? They were in the digital ecosystem, could be seen by millions. All they did was take those tweets, paste them onto billboards that were geotagged next to that person's house that actually made that tweet. So they had to own in public the statements that they made. They immediately changed the context in what that message was received. And I encourage you to look it up and check out the case study because it's powerfully emotional. TikTok. If I'm in TikTok, I'm a youthful, exuberant, exciting brand, right? Like if I'm not in TikTok, then I'm probably old, outdated, and I'm not in touch. Facebook, right? Facebook is another one. Like they are a progressive digital brand, but the way that they marketed trust when they had trust issues is that they bought newspapers and they bought out of home and they bought TV. They bought traditional channels because those are trusted mediums that convey that this is a serious pledge from that business. If they just did a digital video, it just would have felt like another one of their ads. Fearless Girl, instead of, again, just doing another content piece, why don't go out there and create a piece of media that says more than any creative message or ad that you put in front of somebody could. So at the end of the day, just remember, you're not going to see Nike in the classifieds. That's not what they play. Like that says a different thing about the brand. And you're not going to see Rolex in Bacon Busters. So context, environment, and media really matters because that placement conveys something about your brand. So even though these environments might over-index about your audience consumption, they might not be right for the brand. So think about that fit as well. So that's me in a nutshell. I've got 10 critical questions here that I would go through in answering that brief, which these are things that I would nudge you guys to consider. And then we can have a bit of a discussion. So first is reframe the challenge when we're thinking about how we do that. The key questions I'd ask is what's impeding the marketing goal? And ultimately, what's the marketer going to be evaluated from a success point of view? What's the category strengths, what weaknesses, opportunities, and threats from a comms perspective, media perspective, and also just a general product perspective? Which audience will buy this? Like there's a famous case study around Old Spice where instead of trying to market to the man, they marketed to his wife because he knew that they were the shopper of the household. So how do we sell her on the benefits of the product? And their sales dramatically increased. But thinking about that's really interesting. Who influences the purchase? We need to go and target those people. How they shop the category and where are the pain points along there, because that's really where we can add disproportionate effectiveness for the client. And then once you've gotten to that point, you've got a really good understanding of the challenge. When it comes to recommending the solution, look at things in terms of what's emerging in culture, category, or connection/media that we could leverage that will help us capture that novelty effect, reach our audience in an interesting and new way, and really deliver the impact that we're looking for from a brand point of view. So, if people don't trust Suzuki because they've had product failures, then maybe newspaper is actually a good place to put your ad because you want to reinstill that trust. As an example, what channels are effective at bringing the strategy and the idea to life? If it's a social strategy and it's all about engaging participation, then putting it in an environment like Pinterest is probably different to a TikTok. So which one's actually most organically suited to get the overall campaign activation you're looking out of that? What moments, locations, environments are critical to own? What I mean by that is, like, do you need to be present in urban city environments, again, to create that environment? If you're an urban city SUV, do you need to be in weekend media because you're telling people to get out and explore more and you want to associate with that lifestyle? Where do you need the brand to play to create that halo message? What level of investment's required to activate channels effectively? And that's a whole question in and of itself, but basically that's a question you can ask like a media representative or someone that just gives you ballparks of what TV ads will cost and so forth. And then lastly, how are you tracking, optimizing and reporting performance? Because if you've got that North Star, then ultimately you can link all of your channel objectives and criteria back to that. So hopefully that made sense. I know I raced it and I probably talked a lot at you, and it was probably a bit too much information, but I figured more information is better than less information, and that we can have a discussion afterwards.
No, it's wonderful, Chris. That's absolutely wonderful, Chris. That's a fascinating overview and a lot of really interesting insight there for the students. I just might throw the room open and see if there's any pertinent or deep questions for you. And there might be in chat as well. So I don't know. I'll have a look if I can find chat.
I had a question for you, Chris. You're talking about, preferring long-term brand building creates overall larger sales and better salience. But if you're wanting to also have a high level of interaction and participation throughout that long-term brand building, what would you recommend to keep audiences interested and interacting?
Well, I guess that comes down to a few factors. First and foremost, it's what's the overarching idea that you're engaging the audience with. So that's always a really good point to start, because I'll take the Dundee stuff for example, right? Our idea, the thing that was interesting, was to get the world to believe that this movie was coming, right? We needed to reach everybody, and we still needed to build a brand, but we wanted to create avenues for engagement to prove its legitimacy. So we then had a baseline of awareness in all of the environments that we needed to own: film, media, PR, and across YouTube and trailers where they will be. But we also had a whole bunch of interactive elements that, would stimulate that conversation, drive that engagement. Things as simple as having customized emojis in Twitter so that when people talked about it, they got a little Dundee hat, or even environments like, having IMDb pages that allowed people to, forums that allowed them to discuss what they were hoping they were going to see in the movie and so forth. Catering to two different audiences of, there's going to be those that are heaps passionate and they're going to propel the message and drive that to reach, but then there are also going to be those people that deliver. There's going to be those channels that just tell people that it's coming and gets it on their radar.
I have a question also. How does media planning sort of work for out of home if you're going to do some sort of publicity? How do you start ballparking budgets for that sort of stuff?
It depends on, it depends on the role of out of home. And so there's a range of different things, right? If your role of out of home is reach, then in terms of looking at things, we would go to tools that will tell us how much we can reach on a heavy, medium, lightweight campaign across a whole bunch of different assets. If you're doing a publicity stunt, I would imagine it would be selecting a billboard that is in the perfect placement and environment to drive that attention. So an example could be, if you wanted to agitate Scott Morrison, you might buy the billboard at the Shark Stadium because the placement of that message there is actually going to get a bit of PR because it's an ultimate prank, right? And so that would cost you like $10,000, $15,000 or whatever. If you wanted to buy an airport out of home ad, probably cheaper at the moment. But, historically, because they're high net worth individuals, there's high traffic population, and all of those factors increase the cost and the desirability of asset, supply and demand. You could be looking at upwards of $500,000 for one of those billboards. So being choiceful in those environments is key. What I will say, though, is that there is a significant increase in digital out-of-home inventory and premium high-impact digital out-of-home inventory, which is on rotation, therefore is actually more cost-efficient for you to activate as well. So you could, if you wanted to, time limit your out-of-home message so that you're not paying for a billboard for a lunar 30-day period. You're paying specifically for that day to make that statement, and you're owning it in that environment. So there's some smart things you can do in there.
But that'd be a digital billboard.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's Chris. With the traditional billboards, the fixed billboards are they still a 3-month buy, or you can buy 30 days?
30 days. 30 days. Most of them are sold on lunars.
Yeah. And that 500,000 figure, like for the high traffic areas, say at Sydney Airport or Brisbane Airport, Melbourne Airport, would that be? Are you saying for like a month? For
yeah, that would be a typical sort of lunar. You could probably in terms of like digital out of home, if you wanted to have like a pretty solid medium weight campaign across multiple screens in urban environments, for 2 weeks, you could probably get a pretty solid campaign for like 150K. It just depends on the premiums you'll pay to where you want to place that billboard. So what's the Young and Jackson site in Federation Square? Even though that's digital, that's expensive because that is a very premium placement, high foot traffic, highly aesthetically desirable site. So they can afford to price that more aggressively.
And I think it's important too, Chris, to mention to the students that that's literally for the media cost, not the actual production of the actual artwork or the actual signage.
Yeah, which is why digital out of home is always is fast replacing your static out of home, is because it's reducing those costs. So similar thing happened to cinema. You used to actually have to take your TV ad and turn it into a film reel, which was an expensive process, and then put it in there. Whereas nowadays they're all digital. You can whack a YouTube ad on there, and that's easy enough said and done.
Yeah.
I'd say there's a little bit of negotiation with out of home at the moment in market. So I think the prices would be down a bit. So I guess there's an opportunity that the budget, which is limited, can actually probably do a lot more than it would 6 months ago. The campaign the students are doing is mid next year or thereabouts. Was there specific dates, guys? I'm trying to remember because I don't have it. No.
I think it was June.
Before November, I think.
Yeah, so forecasting what the market's going to be in 6 months' time, 9 months' time, I guess, is a little bit here and there, hit and miss. But I guess you will be able to do more financially, in terms of the media spend.
Like having a in the vacuum of a pitch and knowing that we're in a culturally precarious time, we would assume that we would have a bit more negotiation clout when it comes to booking these assets. The other thing I'd say is what a lot of the media publishers are starting to do is get a lot better at dynamic and live measurement, because that then reinstates value to those assets, but also allows them to predict reach impacts more broadly to marketers. So you can say, currently in Pitt Street in Sydney, foot traffic is extremely low because they use like mobile data triggers to be able to identify how many people are in an area at a given time, so therefore how many people are in proximity to that billboard. But over the next 2 weeks, as restrictions ease, all of a sudden that population grows, and so your reach for that becomes higher, which we all know has a effect on the efficient costs of that media. So what cost you $10,000 to reach 100 people in that place a week ago, for that same 10,000, you might actually reach 300 people, and then therefore on a cost per reach basis, it's cheaper.
Can I ask you a question in terms of, sorry, I'm sure students have got questions. I just want to ask you one quick one, and that's the situation where you find you have a client that says they want two things. So they want to build brand salience. So, they want to lift the campaign, but there's an increasing desperation for sales. They know they're not number one in the market. I don't know who I'm talking about. Hypothetically. But their view, their strategy seems to be moving, impacted by, obviously the situation around them. How do you battle that?
I mean, that's the constant struggle. To be honest, it's a conversation you almost have on a daily basis with certain clients, because they've got immediate pressures and then they've got ambitions. I don't think there's a client or a marketer in the country that doesn't understand the importance of building a brand. But at the end of the day, it's how much are they willing to put their career on the line for a result 3 years from now versus a result tomorrow. What I would say is having evidence-based marketing theory and benchmarks is usually the way that we combat that conversation. So if you don't have anything, that Burnett and Field, long and short of it, as a general yardstick, is generally a good place to start. So invest, as a broad rule of thumb, 60% of your activity in building that long-term brand perception, and 40% of it focused on sales driving stuff. And more focused areas, burst buy strategies as opposed to always on. Some of those strategies that come into fore. But typically what we do from a day-to-day basis with our clients is we've got analytic modeling that's tethered to their actual sales and their actual media mix performance. And so the conversation's generally a lot easier. It's like, we show that if you end up prioritizing sales today, that's going to cost you $4 million in 3 years, sort of thing.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know who I'm referencing, but thank you for that. Questions, guys?
That graph you showed before, where it had the steps and the metaphor about the tree, what did you say that graph had a specific name?
So that's in that document that I was talking about just then. Trying to think what that's called.
The tree graph.
Yeah, the tree graph. It's that's that Burnett and Fields long and short of it document that I was talking about. Hang on, let me.
Les Burnett, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Basically, if you search like Les Burnett and Peter Field in anything, you'll be able to find, like in Walk or another document, anything that sits there. But as a general rule of thumb, inside the chat box is basically a good summary of that as an article, and it'll help open up the rabbit hole for you to go and find out different factors around media selection and choice.
Thank you.
We were talking earlier about how COVID is affecting media consumption, particularly in Victoria with out of home. Less people are outside, therefore less people are interacting with out of home media. What are you predicting the top mediums will be next year in a post-COVID world? Do you think that how we're interacting with it now will change it long term, or do you think it'll go back to what it was last year?
Good question. I like that one. So here's my general point of view in BC versus AC versus BC, right? So there was a before COVID moment, there was an after COVID moment, but I think that there are a lot of doomsayers and evangelists that talk about the fact that all of our media consumption is going to dramatically change. It's going to be a new normal, and everything's going to completely reshift in terms of how consumers come into contact with brands. My argument to that is that we are pretty habitual creatures, and we always gravitate to the same thing. We're lazy, right? We gravitate to what we like and the path of least resistance. And so what you'll probably find is that it's pretty elastic in terms of the media consumption. As soon as I'm allowed to go back outside, I'm going to flood the streets, and I'm going to walk past a whole bunch of billboards, and I'm going to my TV consumption is going to go down, and my out-of-home consumption is going to go up. I'm all of a sudden going to listen to radio again, and all of that sort of behavioural change. What I will say, though, is what COVID does act as is almost like a cultural accelerant to emerging trends and behaviours. So if you look at what happened with SARS, in particular in South Korea, they were a country that was, slowly getting accustomed to the concept of e-commerce. All of a sudden, that they had the same effect. Everyone got locked in, and e-commerce became the normative shopping behavior. They saw how easy and convenient it was, and then all of a sudden, you have some of the biggest e-commerce brands in the world go through the roof. Now they have like the highest e-commerce penetration of any country in the developed world. So, what I would say is, an interesting thing to think about in the car buying journey is a lot more people are now experiencing digital dealerships. A lot more people are actually, using AR to actually have a look inside the car. A lot of people are now buying cars sight unseen off of a website. People are buying Audis, like you're talking $250,000 cars off a website, and some of these people are just having to get it's created a whole new way to sell cars to audiences where the dealer will drive the car to your house to drop it off so that you can have a test drive. So you don't even have to go out of your way to go and visit the dealer anymore, which would have been before COVID, that would have been never before heard of, because that dealership environment is such a powerful conversion environment because they've walked through that door, and so therefore they've shown a lens of commitment, and it's an easy way to manipulate them into a sale in that environment. But to go onto their turf and be this sort of subservient seller, you wouldn't have done that before. But necessity breeds innovation, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I've heard that about Volkswagen too. That they've actually got a digital test drive now online. Yeah, so and they're selling cars online, the top end Volkswagens. Which I was just going to ask you a question about that, Chris, with the fact that obviously we're dealing with cars in obviously dealerships, and how. And you said you haven't worked on cars before, but how much emphasis from a location point of view, and we were just talking about the fact that people are doing it online now. How much emphasis from a media point of view is the dealership location? Is there anything in that?
I mean, in terms of directing me to where I can buy one, yeah, I guess it is relevant. But what you'll actually see through a lot of that path to purchase research and some of those findings, because I had a bit of a sneak peek and a look at what some of them were saying, is, in 2018, the number of dealership visits was like 2.4, and now the number of dealership visits is 1.4. So people are making up their mind a lot more before they walk into a dealership in the first place. So as soon as I walk into a Suzuki dealer, then you probably can hazard a guess that I haven't kicked the tires in 3 other dealers beforehand, so I'm a higher percentage to convert. So I think that's really interesting. The other thing I'd also say to that is, if you do a good enough job at driving demand, and it's a high what could you call it, a high consideration purchase, then the lengths that you're willing to go to secure that purchase will be higher. So if I could only get an Aston Martin in Broken Hill, but I really wanted an Aston Martin, I would book an Airbnb and I'd go to Broken Hill.
Yeah, I get that with a particular sort of vehicle or a particular sort of product, because there's it's this dream need, there's an identification with that sort of, you know what I mean? But with this product, Suzuki, where it's number 8 or 9 or something in car sales, or less, or even lower.
14, I think.
Okay. It's a very competitive sector. Well, you know that, Chris. It's not first point preference, you know what I mean? It's somewhere.
Yeah. I look at things like Great Wall and SsangYong and some of those other ones, which aren't like major nameplates, but like what they sell themselves on is they're the next wave of like the Korean car agitation that happened in the market, right? So there used to be like, you would never touch a Kia or a Hyundai or any of those cars when I was growing up. They were always like, yeah, you pay for what you get. You pay $14,000 and you got a shit box for 3 to 5 years that you're having to pay off. Whereas if you spend 20 grand and you got a laser, you would probably have a more reliable car. But these days, every car is so reliable. Every car comes with a 7-year, 500,000 kilometer warranty. But there's no opportunity costs to me buying one car over another, right? Like I can buy more affordable cars. So if you look at Great Wall and SsangYong, they've got all of the possible features that you could fit inside a four-wheel drive, as reliable as a Ford Ranger for a quarter of the cost. And so if you can actually figure out a way to make that brand feel permissible socially to drive, then all of a sudden the equation is it's a cool car and it's way cheaper and I'm going to get my money's worth. I'll actually travel and go out of the way to consider that car.
Yeah.
I was wondering, is there any, what's your opinion on advertising through AI? So, for example, if someone goes, "Hey Siri, what do you think of a Suzuki?" Or "Hey Siri, where's the closest car dealership?" Like, is there something that we can tap into there? Because that, "Hey Google," those areas are becoming bigger and more commonly used, routinely used by people as well, to the point where you can have your shopping list through Google.
Yep, 100%. I would also say, back to my point about medium is the message. Whilst voice, voice command or what they call conversational interfaces, the penetration in Australia is pretty tiny at the moment. I think there's about 5, maybe 6% of households that have it. But that 5-6% of households are early adopter, tech advanced, and sometimes just the notion you being in that environment and having an Apple Watch app or having interactive buying solution through a Google Home or the like signals you're an innovative, dynamic, future forward brand. And if one of your perception challenges as Suzuki to a young tech obsessed generation is that you feel like you're a bit of a cheap brand that's a bit of a throwaway, by starting to have some of those tactics, it can actually have a disproportionate halo. What you'll also understand is the audience that you want to get into the car, I would assume if they are younger, are going to be more likely on an index level to be heavy consumers of that as a buying mechanism. So you've got permissibility to say to a client, let's at least put it forward as a test and learn solution, because we know that we can actually get a disproportionate population of our audience in that environment. We're not wasting media chasing people that aren't there.
That's great. Thank you. Oh, look. Oh, by the way, we probably need to wrap it up. We're way past 6 now. This is an hour long viewer. So I just any final question? This is the final question before we call it the end to this session of the Virtual Cafe. I'd like to thank Chris Colter from Initiative again. It's been a wonderful session, lots of insights. Caleb, you've got the last question.
Yeah, I've got a quick question. Just back to the COVID topic real quick. If your client was looking to avoid the effects of COVID going forward, is it best to look at industry performance and consumer behavior from times before COVID, or is it good to incorporate trends and stuff that has happened this year as well?
I mean, that's a good question. And, the way that I would end up going back to a client on that, it's a bit of a cop-out, but it's actually the way that we would actually do it in the real world, is we would say you need to have a contingency solution. So projecting forward, assuming that COVID is all gone back fine, this would be your media mix, and this is where we would focus our effort. However, if there's a 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th wave, which I sincerely hope for all of us that there isn't, but if there is and it goes back into effect, we know what's going to happen from a media point of view. So let's downweight some of our arterial out of home and let's upweight our retail out of home. Let's shift money from radio activations into streaming Spotify, and pivot your media spend to follow consumer behavior, and just have a contingency plan to do that.
Look, Chris, that's been absolutely wonderful. Thank you kindly for your time today. Like I say, this is recorded and available to students. So thank you for your time, and we'll catch you all next week, students.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris.
Thank you.
No worries, guys.
Thank you so
All the
much.
best. Good luck.